The old house on Elm Street had stood vacant for years before I moved in. Its large, creaking halls and antique furnishings spoke of a bygone era. And though most people in town whispered about its sinister past, I saw it as a place to escape. I needed the quieter refuge from the chaos of my life, and this house promised just that. Or so I thought. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, cleaning, and trying to restore some semblance of order to the dusty rooms. It was on the fourth night that I noticed something peculiar about the mirror in the upstairs hallway. It was a tall, ornate piece, framed with dark wood carved into intricate, almost hypnotic patterns. It seemed older than the house itself, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't bring myself to move it. The mirror became a centerpiece of my unease. It was odd whenever I walked past. I felt compelled to look, as though some invisible force demanded my attention. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. But then, one evening, I saw him. I was returning from the kitchen, a mug of tea in hand, when my reflection in the mirror caught my eye. Only it wasn't my reflection. The figure staring back at me had my face but moved differently. His eyes held a cold, calculating gaze, and his lips curled into a faint, mocking smile. I froze, the mug slipping from my hand and shattering on the wooden floor. For a moment, I stood paralyzed, staring at the man in the mirror as he stared back at me. Then, he raised his hand and waved. My heart raced, and I spun around, half expecting someone to be standing behind me. But the hallway was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. It was just me, pale and shaken, my wide eyes reflecting my terror. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, or a momentary lapse in sanity. Sleep deprivation, perhaps. But the occurrences didn't stop. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle changes in the mirror. Objects in the reflection weren't quite where they should be. The vase on the table appeared to shift its position. The shadows seemed darker, deeper. And then there was the other man. He appeared more frequently now. Sometimes he simply stood in the background, watching, his expression unreadable. Other times he mimicked my movements, but with a slight delay, as though he was a second too slow to copy me perfectly. Once I saw him walk out of the frame while I remained still, my feet firmly planted in front of the mirror. I began to dread the nights. The silence of the house amplified every creak, every groan of the old wood. My attempts to cover the mirror failed. The sheet I draped over it always seemed to slide off by morning, no matter how securely I tucked its end. The more I tried to avoid the mirror, the more it seemed to call to me, like a siren's song I couldn't ignore. The breaking point came on a stormy night. Thunder rumbled outside, shaking the house to its foundation. The power had gone out, and I stumbled through the dark with a flashlight, its narrow beam barely illuminating the hallway. As I approached the mirror, I saw him again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood other figures, their faces obscured by shadow. They seemed to writhe and shift, their forms indistinct yet horrifyingly real. The man in the mirror stepped closer, his eyes locking onto mine. His smile widened, revealing teeth that were far too sharp, too menacing. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. To my horror, the surface rippled like water, and his hand began to push through. I stumbled back, my flashlight clattering to the floor and rolling away, casting Wild, erratic beams of light across the walls. The figures behind him began to reach out as well, their grotesque hands clawing at the barrier between us. I ran. I didn't stop to grab anything, didn't even put on my shoes. I sprinted out of the house into the rain, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I reached the edge of the property, I turned back, expecting to see the figures chasing me. But the windows were dark, and the house stood silent, as though nothing had happened. I never went back. The house remains empty to this day, its windows staring blankly out at the world like the eyes of a long-forgotten corpse. People in town still whisper about it, and sometimes, late at night, I think about the mirror and the man trapped within. Or was he ever trapped at all? I moved to a new city, started fresh, and tried to forget. But every now and then, I catch my reflection in a window or a puddle. And for a fleeting moment, I think I see him, watching, waiting, smiling. The mirror may be gone, but the other man remains.